Let's take a look at processing Megascan's assets for us to use. Now, with your Megascans account, I would recommend downloading Bridge. We could use the Houdini bridge that comes with Megascans, and it is very good, but we don't need everything that it creates, so instead of this, I'll just do it manually. Since we're working on a massive scale, I'm only interested here in the textures or surfaces and the large scene assembly items, rock groups, etc. Now the first place that I would look is definitely the free option. Let me just take a look here. And I would take a look here to try and find what I need. And this allows you to download these options without affecting your points. But really, the 90 points a month should be plenty. I'll also remind you here that if you have only downloaded Megascans for this workshop, please remember to cancel your membership before the renewal date. So if you can't find what you're looking for here, then we'll just jump up and take a look at the library. Now let's find a nice looking rock formation, and please don't just grab anything. Try and make sure that it does fit your environment. So here I'll just type in rocks 3D and find something that suits. Now I have already downloaded something that I can use. This guy here, the Icelandic terrain. Now you have a few options here. I won't explain them all, they're pretty self-explanatory again. In this case, I'm happy with the 2K texture resolution, as we don't plan on getting very close to this. Of course, if you're working month to month, then whilst you can, I would definitely take the 8K. You can always downsize it later if you want. And I always just grab the high poly source. And this is just because I can, again, poly reduce this later. For me, the albedo, the bump, and the normal bump is enough. I might also grab the roughness. We have the options of JPEGs, EXRs, or JPEG and EXR. This is fine. And I always download the FBX. So I have already downloaded this, but you will see a download button here. So just hit download. Now back in Houdini, I'll throw down a GeoNode. And inside here a file node. And navigate to the object. And find high. Unfortunately, the naming here is terrible, so you might just need to try a few different ones before you arrive on the one that you downloaded. Now, the reason I don't use LODs, or the LODs supplied by Megascans, should I say, is that even at the highest quality, they're still a little bit too low poly for my tastes, even at this distance, or the distance I plan to use them at. Plus, I also like to have as much control as possible, and this is somewhat of a personal choice. So this is too high. We are at something like, let me just get the information, 2 million primitives. So let's put in a poly reduce, and I can probably take this right down to something like 5% for now. The other thing to notice, if we look at the information here, is we have a lot of attributes that we don't need. Now, it doesn't add much to the memory, but we may as well get rid of them if we can. So drop down an attribute delete. And choose everything. So delete everything apart from P. Here we can keep. Here we can delete everything. And here too. That's better. We also need to check the scale here, and Houdini uses 1 unit as 1 meter, so that's what we need to stick to. Now, unfortunately, Megascans only gives us a tiny little icon that is somewhat unhelpful on the asset info, but we can use this as a guide. So, in absence of an actual human character that I can bring in, I'll just make a box and make it about 1.8 in height, just so it's roughly the size of a human. You can see our Megascans asset here is far too big. So I'll take it down to something like 0.05. And check it against our box. It could probably be a little smaller, but this is close enough. Now, as an aside, the difference between Maya and Houdini is 100 times. So anything exported from Maya into Houdini needs to be scaled down to 0.01. So back into the asset here, the next thing I would do is drop down a material node, and I would point this to the material. Now, we haven't created one yet, and we won't until next week, but for now I'll add this material node in anyway, in anticipation for this. It's also worth bearing in mind, if the shape isn't working for you, you can drop down an edit node, select points, press T to activate the transform, and use the soft selection here if there's anything you would like to change. It is much better than Maya's soft selection, which can be quite slow. Now, finally, I want to save this out as an alembic, so I can use the ROP alembic output and plug this in. We can leave everything as it is and save it wherever you want. I usually just save it back within the same library to make sure I don't lose it. And I can use it on any project. And bring it back in. Nice. On the top level, I would just name this something appropriate, like Rock Assembly A or something, and use a null to move it to where it needs to be. Now, I could use the transform parameters on the top of this node, but by using the null, I can quickly just remove any transforms if I need to quickly get it back to the origin. Awesome. So let's just take a quick look at what the final scene looks like in Houdini. So this is the final scene. Let me just hide the fog. And you can see what all those scatters look like together. Now, I usually set up a scene like this. The scatter geometry to one side, here. The instance nodes together, and then any hand-placed geometry at the base. And we also have all the shaders within one shopnet. Now, we'll talk about shaders next week. Let's take a quick look at how one of these trees are processed. I'll just hide everything in the viewport and perhaps go to this guy here. Now, like the rock formation, I plug in the material, and in this case, I felt the trees were still a little bit too high poly, so I added some poly reduce to take this down a little. The other thing that I did is to take the pine leaves, reduce how many we had, and then increase their size. So just to quickly demonstrate how I did this, in case this is something you need to do. Now, you could go back to SpeedTree, but just in case, we may as well take a look at how to do this within Houdini. So using a delete node, I removed 5 out of every 6 polygons. I then used a connectivity node to create groups for each continuous polygonal mesh that now exists. You can see if I go to the geometry spreadsheet, this new class exists, and each group of points is now contained within a class. Now this worked because the pines that I used are single poly. If they weren't, I would do this a little bit differently. After this, I use a for each node. If you are unfamiliar with the for each node, this allows us to create a set of operations that we can run over a set of objects or groups that we have created. We have the group begin here and the group end. To make this easier to work with, we can set this to single pass, and that just means we only see one of these classes, and then we can see what this transform node is doing to just one of these classes. A quick way to make something bigger is to drop down a transform node and use this little bit of vex here. And what this is doing is it's moving the pivot to the center of the X of this object, the center of the Y, and the center of the Z, which just puts it exactly in the middle. And then we do a uniform scale which doubles the size. So the for each is fetching the piece or the point, and on the for each end we are checking by pieces or points, and it is also set to primitives. Now if I disable single pass, we can see what this looks like throughout the whole tree. Before and after. Nice. And again, this has just been saved out into an alembic. So this is just another way to optimize the geometry. If I take a look at the alembic where we are bringing these pines back in, I'll jump inside here. You can see we're using the same system, just underscore 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, etc. And inside this, all we need now is the alembic, and I have set this to unpack alembic. This just allows us to access the attributes a little easier, and I haven't personally noticed any performance issues between unpacked alembics and packed alembics here. Let's take a look at one of the scatters, perhaps just the pine tree scatter. Inside, you'll notice something very similar. You'll notice some paint nodes that we used, some delete nodes just to remove some geometry before we scatter. So let's take a look at the attribute VOP and jump inside. And everything inside you will be familiar with from the previous videos. So I began with just a simple noise. If I just plug this into the color, which is then multiplied by the sediment here. Now the sediment is looking at roughly the same. Now the sediment is looking at roughly the same areas as the water. So what this is doing here is inverting where the water is and clamping it just to make sure that we add some areas but make sure they are away from where the water is, as I'd like to control that separately. We also have the Y axis here, and this is just to control and make sure that it doesn't grow too high. I'm using the dirt mask here to make sure that it doesn't grow around the river banks, and the bedrock to make sure it doesn't grow on any of the rock. And finally, I'm taking the normal angle and removing it again from the slope. Nice. So if we take a look at the header, it's a little bit different. Again, I'll jump inside the attribute VOP. Now this is using more or less the same as the pine trees, except we are also adding in this Voronoi noise to add the rivers or the streams through the center of some of these patches. And I'm also taking the normals here and finding the x-axis, which is pointing into the distance here, and removing it from anything that doesn't face this way. Now this is because the camera is facing in this direction. So I can get away with something as simple as this. If it was a little bit more complex and the camera was moving, then perhaps I would maybe set up some sort of camera culling. And this is all to try and help with the efficiency and make sure we're not, creating things here that we don't see. So coming back out to the top level, at the bottom, we just have all of the hand placed geometry that we spoke about a bit earlier. So here's the rock group, for instance. And I have also scattered on top of these. Nice. So in a production environment, what we would do is we would take everything we have here and we would create an asset, a Houdini digital asset, which can be imported into other scenes. And we may cover that a bit later. In the last video for this week, what we'll do is take a look at using VDBs to create some procedural geometry.